Sounds good.
Okay. All right. All right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I feel so very honored and privileged to have so many people supporting me through this journey. So just go ahead and get started. So the project title is Identity, Discrimination, and Belonging, the Arab American Muslim Experience. So for my dissertation, I wanted to work on something that was really important to me, but also really important in expanding this particular field of research, which is Arab American and Muslim American mental health. Before I get started with my actual presentation, I just want to give a big shout out to my parents, Dr. Ibtisam and Dr. Mustafa. I'm very excited to join them in this doctor rank, inshallah, very soon. So for today's presentation, we're going to go through a few things. So I just want to set you up so you know what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the background. Where does this idea come from? What were I thinking? What do we already kind of know? Then we'll talk about the current study. What am I really looking at in this dissertation? What are the questions that I'm trying to answer? Then we'll go over the methods section, which I'll talk about my participants, who are the participants that I collected data from and how did I collect that data. We'll talk about the results, of course. What did I find? I think I found some pretty interesting things and I'm excited to share those with you. Then we'll talk about the main takeaways. So now that we know this information, what is it? What are we really kind of saying with the results that I found? Of course, there are limitations because nobody is perfect. So we'll have to talk about that. And then we'll end with implications and future research. So where can this research be taken moving forward? Okay, so something that I think a lot about, but was also a really big, is a really important part of my research is really trying to understand what does it mean to be Muslim and what does it mean to be Arab? We know that being Muslim is a religious identity. We know that being Arab, Middle Eastern, North African is a racial ethnic identity. And we also know that there's a lot of overlap between those identities, but they are different. And so when it comes to our understanding of ourselves, and when I say our, I'm specifically talking about Muslim Arab folk, when it comes to our understanding of ourselves, to what extent do Muslim Arabs understand their Muslim identity as separate from their Arab identity, or is there a lot of overlap in those identities? Another very common experience, unfortunately, but is a very common experience for Arab American Muslims is experiences of discrimination. The conflation of these identities, this overlap, doesn't just happen from within the community, it also happens outside of the community. There's a misconception that Muslims are Arabs and Arabs are Muslim. And so when it comes to experiences of discrimination, to what extent are Muslims and Arabs perceiving those experiences as targeted towards either identity? There's also a lot of overlap in terms of the values and in terms of what is important for Muslims, what is important for Arabs when we talk about community values, family values, etc. And so there's a lot here to really explore. Like I said, experience of discrimination is a really big part of the Arab Muslim experience. We know that Muslims experience the most religious-based discrimination. And we also know that compared to Christian Arabs, Muslim Arabs are more likely to experience discrimination, but also more likely to experience discrimination when they are more acculturated to dominant society. So something here is happening. And so it's really important for us to really dig deep into what are the ways that we can support this community and really understand their experiences. A really big issue in conducting this research is the methodology, is trying to collect this data, trying to find out how many Muslims are there in America? How many Arab Americans are there in America? Where are they? And a really big barrier to that is the lack of a Middle Eastern, North African category within the US Census. And so currently, Middle Eastern, North African individuals, just as like myself, like my advisor, Dr. Awad, we're considered white by the census. And so it makes it very difficult to understand, first of all, who are the Arab Americans? What countries do they originate from? But also, what are their experiences in terms of economic experiences, health-related experiences, etc. And so this is a really big issue that comes up in doing this research. So the other piece that I was really interested in, right? So we talked about identity, we talked about discrimination. The other piece that I was really interested in is belonging. So we know that being part of an Arab community, being part of a Muslim community, experiences of belonging and community are really important and are really big values in those communities. And so I wanted to understand, like, okay, we can look at how identity affects mental health. We can look at how discrimination affects mental health, but I'm always curious why. And we know that belonging is a basic human need for us as humans, provides meaning, it provides access to resources, it's linked to better health outcomes. And so what I wanted to know is how can we understand these experiences of identity and discrimination as they relate to belonging? Can belonging really explain why these experiences are important? So here we have the model of racial cumulative trauma. I won't spend too much time on it, but this is a model that was created to kind of understand the experiences, the trauma experiences of MENA individuals. There's also social identity theory, which tells us that we define ourselves based off of the groups that we belong to. And identity centrality is really the piece that the concept that I'm really interested in. How important is being Muslim? How important is being Arab to your sense of self? Okay, so let's talk about my current study and what I was looking at. So for my first research question, I basically proposed this model, and I'll go through each pieces of this model for everybody so that you can really understand what I'm looking at here. But what I wanted to see is, what I was theorizing is that this is the relationship between these variables that's going to come up from the data that I collect. And so we'll go through each one, but that's the first research question is, does this model fit the data? Or does the data fit the model? And so the first piece here that I was really curious about, right, we talked about that, that conflation, that overlap between ethnic identity and religious identity, is to what extent is there an overlap between people's understanding of their ethnic identity and their understanding of their religious identity? And also, to what extent is there overlap between individuals' understanding of being discriminated based off of their ethnic identity or being discriminated based off of their religious identity? So this is a really important part of the model, because I wanted to see, for the data that I collect, are these going to be, is there going to be a lot of overlap? Are they going to be separate? My second research question is trying to understand, to what extent do all of these different variables predict psychological distress? And so you'll see negative signs and positive signs. These are all theory. These are my hypotheses. And so I was hypothesizing that as identity centrality goes up, then psychological distress goes down, and the opposite for ethnic discrimination. The more discrimination someone experiences, the more distress they experience. I was also interested to see, to what extent does ethnic identity and discrimination predict sense of belonging? And so I theorized that more identity centrality, then the more belonging someone would experience, the more discrimination they experience, the less belonging they experience. And so here's that part of why. So I wanted to see, to what extent does belonging actually explain the relationship between identity and discrimination and distress? Does belonging actually tell us why these relationships exist? All right, so let's get to my data. All right, so I was able to collect data from 186 Arab American Muslims between the ages of 18 and 29. And I'm really curious about the experiences of individuals within this age group, because it's in a really important developmental stage where people are really thinking about their identities and who they are. In terms of where I collected my sample, it was both community snowball sampling, which basically means that I asked the people around me, who asked the people around them, who asked the people around them. And so that's texting the people I know, putting it on social media, having a flyer, putting it on different listservs, etc. There's also Prolific, which is a crowdsourcing research website where people are paid to take research studies. And so I wanted to get kind of a varied sample. And so these are the countries that my participants reported that they, they have ancestry from. So as you can see, most of my participants were of Palestinian, Egyptian, Yemeni, or Lebanese descent. And then we have other countries as well. Multi-ethnic means that, there were multiple, like maybe a parent was from Iraq and another parent was from Syria. All right, in terms of the age of my participants, the average age was 23 and a half, around 23 and a half, with a standard deviation of 3.31, which basically means that 68% of the sample were between 20 and 27. A little over half were women, which is pretty typical for psychological research studies. In terms of generational status, about between a fifth and a fourth reported that they were first generation immigrants, which means that they were born outside of the US but grew up in the United States. But the larger portion were second generation, so they were born and raised in the United States. In terms of sect, most individuals identified as Sunni, but we had a group of people who were Shia. These are the measures, the specific measures that I used. And so when we talk about these concepts like identity, centrality, and discrimination, how do you change these? How do you capture these concepts into actual numbers, right? Because that's what I'm really doing here is I'm analyzing numbers. And so these are the different measures that I use. These are different surveys that I gave individuals that asked them about their experiences. So for ethnic identity centrality, I used the MIBI and I adapted it from questions about being Black to questions about being Arab MENA or being Muslim. So basically I gave individuals I adapted the centrality subscale twice, and I gave individuals those survey questions, the everyday discrimination scale, and here are some of the sample items that people were answering. So you can get a sense of what people were, saying, yes, they have these experiences towards or not. Okay, so let's talk about what I found. So the first thing, so when it comes to doing a path analysis, which is what I did in terms of the analysis that I did, we have to do we have to check some assumptions. We have to say that the data looks a certain way in order for me to do this analysis using path analysis, regression, whatever it is that I use. There was an assumption that was violated, multicollinearity, which basically means that for the measures that looked at ethnic discrimination and religious discrimination, those were so overlapping, they were so correlated with each other that people were practically talking about the same experiences. And so remember how part of my dissertation was understanding to what extent do these experiences overlap with each other. And it turns out for discrimination, there was such a big overlap that I made the decision to actually combine it into one variable, into an ethnic religious discrimination variable. And so if you remember, this is the path model that I was talking about. This is what I was looking at. And so basically what I did is I took the ethnic discrimination and religious discrimination, and I just made it into one. One variable. So now this is the model 2.0 that I'll be looking at in my analysis. Okay, in terms of correlations, there's just some things so I correlated all of the variables separately. One thing that I want to say is that, sometimes you can just do a correlation and say like, oh, this is related to this, or this is related to this. What's really cool about doing a path analysis is that you can actually account for the different variables. So sometimes, ethnic religious discrimination might be related to mental health outcomes, but religious identity might be affecting that relationship. And so with just doing a correlation, you're not accounting for how religious identity or any of these other variables are affecting this relationship. And so that's something to keep in mind with correlation. And a path analysis does account for all of those things. So you can see, how do these variables uniquely predict these other variables?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Go back to the model.
The previous? Okay.
Yes. All right. So I want to make sure that I'm following your logic. So yeah. You essentially used your statistical findings because they were so highly correlated
Right.
to combine ethnic discrimination and religious discrimination. So your statistical findings led to the change, which you then justify theoretically. Is that
So there
correct?
is a theoretical justification as well. Yeah, which I can speak to.
Okay. Yeah, because let me finish my thought,
Sure,
and you can
sure.
sort of speak to that, because it sort of made me wonder if, if you were going to sort of, combine this, and then sort of provide a theoretical justification, could you not do the same thing for ethnic identity centrality and religious identity centrality? Although I do know that their correlations were not as high. I think it was around 0.4 or so.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I'm trying to make sure that the logic is consistent, that you combine it in one instance and you don't combine it in another instance. So could you just speak to that?
Yeah. So I didn't talk about how ethnic identity and religious identity were correlated with each other, which they were related to each other. But if we think about the kind of the circles that I have here with ethnic identity, with ethnic discrimination, religious discrimination, there was a large enough overlap, and there is a cutoff score that's usually given that you can kind of then combine. You can kind of say like this is basically measuring the same thing. And for ethnic identity and religious identity, they weren't as overlapping, so I couldn't make that justification statistically. Theoretically, it does follow that ethnic identity discrimination and religious discrimination would overlap. I talk about it in my document in a few different ways, but one way that I'd like to describe it here is that oftentimes when people experience discrimination, it's not always the case that the intention of the person who is perpetrating the discrimination is made clear. So if someone is, so if you look at some of the items, for example, you're treated with less courtesy, you're called names or insulted. Maybe sometimes the names, if it's a name like towel head, is that because you're Muslim? Is that because you're Arab? Are you treated with less courtesy? Because of you are Arab is more on the perception side of the person who is being targeted. And so it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And when it comes to ambiguous discrimination, we can call it that, people are more likely to kind of report that it's based off of the identities that are important to them. And so one thing that I didn't mention here is that my sample is, and I'm just going to talk about this in my limitation actually, but my sample does have kind of a stronger ethnic identity centrality and a stronger religious identity centrality as well. And so it's possible that because they have those identities close to their sense of self, they're more likely to perceive both of those things happening. Does that answer the question?
That helps. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah. Okay. All right. So in terms of the model, like I said, I combined the two. So I was talking about kind of the distinction between having a path model and talking about the relationships altogether versus correlation versus just a correlation. And so, but I do want to point out what I found in my correlation because I think it's very interesting. So when it comes to the variables that were related to psychological distress, what I found is that women, and this is something that I find actually these two things here, women and younger participants, I think this is really important to note, and something that I found in other samples that I've collected for other data, is that women and younger participants are more likely to report psychological distress. I don't really go over, the reasons behind that in my dissertation, but I do think that this is something important for us to really be considering. What is it about the experience of women? What is it about the experiences of younger participants that would result in more psychological distress? Ethnic identity centrality was, yeah.
Can I just interrupt you and ask a question here?
Yeah.
So do you think that you finding that women are experiencing more psychological distress, do you think that finding would change if you actually had equal like males and females in your studies? Like, do you think that's a statistical artifact?
Yeah.
Based on your sample, or do you think that's an actual finding?
So because
actually, can I add another kind of substance to that? And that would be also, would it be different for those who are identifiably Muslim women versus those who are not identifiable, meaning wearing hijab or not?
Yeah. Really great questions. I've actually written another paper about this. And so thankfully I've done quite a bit of research on this already. So what you find from other research So what you find from other research samples is that Muslim women are more likely to, Muslim women, so not necessarily Arab Muslim women, I want to make that distinction, but Muslim women are more likely to experience or to report more psychological distress. And like I said, in the other samples that I found, it's kind of mixed. There's data that supports this. There's data that says that really there isn't any difference. It could be potentially because of visibility. So Muslim women might be more likely to wear the hijab. One of the papers that I've written recently actually found that the hijab does play a part, but there's also the gendered experience of women. And so it's really important to think about the intersectionality of the different identities that people have. What is it about the socialization of women within our communities? What is it about the support systems that are provided for women? What is it about, again, thinking about what is the relationship between these two? Gigi, you asked me about, do I think it would be different if my sample was more half-half? I really don't think that it would be different because I don't think that it would be different. I think I can probably like summarize like other data that I found to kind of support that. I'm not sure if you're looking for something else.
No, I mean, I think that overall,
Yeah.
Especially just talking about the Arab psychology literature,
Yeah.
we don't have samples that are equal enough.
Right.
So this is a common finding, but we don't actually know if it's a real finding because we don't actually have samples that are comparable to make that statement. So that's just kind of like a
I think that's really important to know. And I think it's important to note with really any psychological research is that these are just kind of like trends that we're finding, and we want to be exploring a little bit more. And if we keep finding these trends with every sample that we find, then maybe there's something here that we need to be exploring a little bit more deeply, for sure. Okay. All right, so religious identity centrality. So basically what I found here is in the correlation is that the more religious identity centrality that someone identified or endorsed, the less psychological distress. So it was an opposite relationship. And then more discrimination, more distress, less belonging, more distress. Some other correlations that I found was belonging and ethnic identity was not correlated with each other, but it was with religious identity, and it was in the opposite direction with discrimination. And then also with discrimination, ethnic identity centrality was correlated in the opposite direction, but not with religious identity centrality. And like I mentioned before, ethnic identity centrality and religious identity centrality were correlated with each other. So the more ethnic identity centrality someone reported, the more important their religious identity was for them, and vice versa. Okay, so let's come back to this model that I have here. I've been looking at this model for a very long time. It's kind of my best friend at this point. So one of the things that's important about having a model like this and being able to actually run the analysis for this model is you have to be very mindful about how many variables do you have, and also how many paths do you have. Can this model actually run? And so this part, I think, I want to explain this in a way that really makes sense for everybody. But basically, I needed to make a change in this model in order for me to be able to run the analysis and have results that are meaningful. And so basically what I had to do is I had to drop one of these lines, because right now it's a just identified model. And so I had to drop one of these lines so that I can have an over-identified model, and I have degrees of freedom of at least one in order to run the analysis. And so because this relationship here between discrimination and religious identity centrality was the weakest correlation, that was the one that was dropped from the model. Not even the weakest, there was just there was no relationship found there at all. And so this is the third and final model that I was able to run. Okay, so what you'll see here is a lot of numbers and different lines. And what the thing to note is that if it's a dotted line, basically I found that there was no, this relationship was not significantly related to each other. And then if there are some asterisks, that means that there is a significant relationship. And so basically to know what to know from this slide here is that my model did fit. My model did fit. So I had a good adequate fit for the model, which is great, but I'll walk through the different pieces of this, this model with you all as well. Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Looking at this model, is there a particular reason why you didn't you didn't look at a bidirectional relationship between religious identity, centrality, ethnic identity, centrality, and sense of belonging? Right now, it's one direction. It's not bidirectional.
So you mean this relationship here?
Yep.
Yeah. So I wanted to see to what extent does there. So two reasons. One of the questions that I was wondering about is to what extent does ethnic identity predict sense of belonging? So if you see a double-sided arrow, what I'm saying is that these things are related to each other, and I'm not necessarily looking for a direction, like one predicts another thing. For where you see just the one-sided arrow, I'm saying that this variable is going to predict this variable. So it's like almost an antecedent to that variable. And so because I was looking at to what extent does sense of belonging explain this relationship between identity and distress, it's important for me to have it be predicted one way. In order to see the mediation, in order to examine the mediation relationship. Yeah. Okay. So my first research question was, does the model fit? What I found is there's evidence towards the model fitting. And so the second research question was, to what extent do these variables predict mental health outcomes, specifically psychological distress? And what I found is that ethnic identity and religious identity did not predict psychological distress. Sense of belonging really did. It's a pretty big number. So basically, the more sense of belonging that someone experiences, the less psychological distress. So really talking about how does, belonging really impact mental health outcomes. And then what I found here, which is what a lot of the research tells us, is that when someone experiences discrimination, they're more likely to experience psychological distress. And so what I found is that 38.4% of the variance was explained through this model, the variance of psychological distress. Like I said before, I was also looking at to what extent did these variables predict sense of belonging. And what I found is that ethnic identity centrality did not predict belonging. However, religious identity centrality did. So the more likely someone was to say that their religious identity is important to their sense of self, then the more sense of belonging that they reported. And then for religious discrimination, there's a negative relationship. So the more discrimination someone experienced, the less belonging that they experienced, the less belonging they reported.
Can you tell me a little bit about what your belonging scale was? What did it measure belonging to what?
Yes, that's a really good question, because what I did not do was ask people to what extent do you belong within the Muslim community? Do you belong within a group? Instead, this measure was asking people just generally, do you feel like you belong with people? Do you feel like you have a just general psychological sense of belonging to others around you? Do you feel like you fit in? Things like that. So it was really just like a general question. It was a really general survey. And I think that future research can really look at whether, like, to what extent does belonging to the Muslim community affect mental health outcomes, belonging to, the Arab community, belong to the American community, belonging to the global community, etc. There's all these different spaces, belonging to your university, to your workspace, to your family, things like that. Yeah. So this measure was looking at just general psychological sense of belonging. I wanted to keep it general. Okay, so belonging as a mediator. So if you remember, I wanted to see to what extent does belonging explain this relationship between identity and distress. So you'll see here that I only have 2 mediations. That's because for ethnic identity centrality, I did not find belonging as a mediator. And so what's interesting here is that, like I said here, religious identity centrality did not predict psychological distress. However, when we bring in however, it was related to it in the correlation. And so what we basically find is that when you add sense of belonging, it actually explains why religious identity is related to psychological distress. So there is a correlation between religious identity centrality and psychological distress. We can say that people who feel that being Muslim is an important sense of their self are less likely to experience mental health outcomes. And what I found here is that is because they have a sense of belonging, because religious identity centrality predicts a sense of belonging, which then predicts less psychological distress. And so this is really interesting that it was like fully explained in this path. Here, what we found is that sense of belonging partially explained. So it means that there's still something else that's explaining this relationship. There's still other things that we can think about, why would discrimination predict psychological distress, right? We can think about there's belonging, but then we can also think about things like, when you experience discrimination, that affects your nervous system. It's just a traumatic response that you're having. It's a traumatic event that's happening to you. So that's going to affect your mental health outcome. But what we did find, though, is that it at least explained some of it. And so people who experience discrimination are less likely to experience belonging, and then are more likely to have psychological distress. Nice. So those are all my results. So let's talk about what can we learn from all of those things. So there's 3 main takeaways that I want us to be thinking about, and that I really want to kind of inform my future research and hopefully other people's future research and the ways that we think about ourselves. So the first thing that we found is that religious identity and ethnic identity were actually seen as separate concepts, but not for discrimination. They were very overlapped. And this really falls well within the theory of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, where she talks about how our experiences of oppression are oftentimes intersectional. So it is because you have multiple minority identities that you have particular experiences. So think about, like being Arab is a particular experience that a lot of people have. Being an Arab woman is going to be different than being an Arab man. Being a Muslim woman is going to be different than being a Muslim man. Being an Arab Muslim is going to be different than being a Black Muslim. Being an Arab Muslim is going to be different from being a Christian Muslim in different ways, because multiple identities that we hold are going to affect our experiences in different ways. In terms of there was some overlap between religious identity and ethnic identity. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but I'm really curious about what is the difference, right? Because they overlap, but they're not completely overlapped. So thinking really about when are we Arab? When is being Arab not different than being Muslim, and when is being Muslim different than being Arab and Middle Eastern? Also, I think it's really important that we found that religious identity predicted belonging, which predicted distress. However, this was not found for ethnic identity, right? We can talk about how religious identity, if you have a strong sense of being Muslim, then maybe you're more likely to have Muslim friends, you're more likely to go to the masjid, you're more likely to participate in activities. But why can't we say the same thing for ethnic identity? Because if you're more likely to identify as being Arab, wouldn't it then be the case that you're more likely to lean into and use the resources of being Arab and Middle Eastern? However, we didn't find that here. And I think that there's a couple of things that we can be thinking about why this might be the case. The first is that we'll talk about both of these kind of at the same time. So the first is what I talked about way earlier on, that lack of category of the MENA Arab identity in the US Census. How does that really affect the lived experiences of people? We can think about it having an impact in different ways. One is that we don't have data to say this is the experiences of Arab Muslim, Arab MENA individuals in America. We don't have data to say MENA individuals are suffering in these different ways. These are the experiences. This is where we could use help. These are the different centers that we can build. This is the different kind of support that we can give. Oftentimes, when you look at things like financial support for minority folk, for ethnic minority folk, there is no Middle Eastern North African. There's usually Black, Latinx, Asian American. And while there could be an argument for, being put in the Asian American category, we know that a lot of like national and regional and a lot of survey data uses the US Census's way of collecting demographic information. And so Middle Eastern fits into the white category. And so how does that really cause the invisibility of this identity and make it really difficult to have coalition and movement around being Muslim? Also, we can think about a lot of the propaganda that's used in America around what it means to be Muslim, who are the terrorists, that it's really a faith tradition that is polarizing people. And so it can be easier for people to kind of garner support around this Muslim identity, especially given the traditions of being Muslim. So praying 5 times a day, going to the mosque to celebrate different parts of your life. There are things that are about being Muslim that kind of almost force people into community. And so these are different reasons that, are potentially why we found this relationship for religious identity and not for ethnic identity. But of course, this is I think a big area of like future research as well. Also, oh, yes.
Is it also another possibility could also be spiritual coping mechanisms as well that may be in place for religious identity, but not necessarily for ethnic identity?
Yeah, I think that's yeah, I can already kind of think about how we can study that. Yeah, that's another interesting thing. So what are the ways that MENA individual are more likely to cope with stress, cope with the things around them compared to what is part of the Muslim tradition? And maybe that can also help us kind of think about that distinction or like that overlap or not overlap between religious identity and ethnic identity is maybe in the coping skills that are used. So that's a really good point. And then lastly, belonging was explained as a significant part of the discrimination and distress link. And so it really was, it really explained why a big part of why discrimination is related to distress. And so really thinking about what does it mean to belong to spaces, and how experiences of discrimination can impact your belonging to different spaces and how that can then impact your work performance, your academic achievement, your ability to relate to other people, your willingness to engage with strangers and make new friends and things like that. And so there's really a lot here that when we think about like, what does discrimination do? It's not just get over it. It really does impact all of these different parts of our lives in different ways. Okay, so let's talk about some of the limitations, because I think it's very important. I can't just say that this data speaks truth to everyone's experience, because that would be a very dangerous thing to say. So the first thing to note is my sample. So in terms of my data collection, most of my data came from people that I know or people that I know or connected to the people around me. And so it makes sense that some of this data might be representative of my experiences and what I know to be true, and that there are groups and categories of Arab Muslim individuals that I don't have access to in that way. And so it's really important to think about like, okay, so this is one sample and it's important. And that's why replication of data, replication of studies is really important, to use multiple samples from different parts of the country, for different people, to really understand, is this something, if someone else did this same exact study and they used their snowball sampling in their community, are they going to find the same exact thing? Of course, a big part is also that, it's really hard to know where the MENA individuals are. So it's easier to kind of, have, to send, it's easier to kind of send different emails to different listservs. But it's hard to kind of really know, am I actually capturing the experiences? Is it really the case that the breakdown that I had for the racial country of origin, is that actually the breakdown of what's of MENA individuals in America? Like I said, the positionality of myself. So to what extent does does the sample really represent me and my community rather than the actual experiences of Arab Muslim folk? And then there's correlation versus causation, which is always really important to talk about. A lot of this data, because I was just collecting data from a one time period, I'm just looking at the correlation between these variables. So I would be very careful to say that this causes this thing, which causes this thing. It's more of what I found here is like these things are related to each other, and there are different ways through longitudinal surveys or doing interventions doing interventions that we could find more causational relationships. And so the data that I have here, what I found here, just kind of gives us like direction in terms of future research, but does also answer really important questions. Okay, so here are some implications and future directions. So I'll start with the theoretical and research implications. Like you've been saying, it's just so interesting to me, identity is just so interesting to me more generally. But when we think about what does it mean to be Arab and what does it mean to be Muslim, I think there's a lot more work that we can be doing in terms of what is the overlap and where is not the overlap. There is unfortunately a tendency for Arab Muslims to kind of claim the religion. And so it's really important to be thinking about Muslim as a religious identity that's larger than ethnic identity. It encompasses more than just ethnic identity, but also really working around battling a lot of these misconceptions that people have. I mean, just recently, one of my coworkers asked me, is being Muslim an ethnic identity? And so it's it's something that like many people are still kind of unaware of. And so really thinking about how can we make a distinction, but also talk about the overlap of these identities. Ethnic religious discrimination. So one thing to really be thinking about is when we're collecting data and we're talking to people about ethnic discrimination and your sample is mostly Muslim, are you also talking about Islamophobia or are you talking about just racism? And can you really make a distinction between racism and Islamophobia for this sample? And so we really need to be, and if you're just talking about Islamophobia, if you're just looking at religious discrimination with individuals, you're missing out a really important piece, which is racism that they experience. And so how do those things overlap? Another thing to really think about is how does the experiences of individuals who live in areas like, the Metro Detroit area or the Metro LA area or other areas of the country where there are a lot of Arab and MENA folk, how do those people experience these different things differently than someone who lives in Little Rock, Arkansas, or another small city, in the country, rural areas. And so really thinking about how does where you live in your community affect all of these things, right? We're talking about belonging. We're talking about, experiences of discrimination. And so your experiences are going to be different based off of where you are from. And so I think this is a really big area of research. Other intersections of identity. So we talked about ethnic and religious, but what about gender? What about socioeconomic status? What about immigration status? What about being a refugee versus being a third generation immigrant? How do those things all affect people's experiences? Also belonging as a construct, right? So I talked about in this study was just your general sense of belonging, but really what does it even mean to belong? Like, how do you really capture this feeling of like connectedness with other people? And then, are you talking about feeling belonging in specific spaces? Are you talking about belonging just generally to the world? Are you talking about belonging to something higher? So like, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to God. So really thinking about how can we understand belonging in the ways that are important to the experiences of people. And then also focusing on well-being rather than distress. So for my research, I was looking at psychological distress, so experiences of, paranoia, anxiety, depression, etc., all of these things, but also in what ways does, identity impact your well-being? Like, to what extent does belonging impact your positive well-being rather than just focusing on distress all of the time? There's also some clinical and policy implications. In terms of clinical implications, it is not very often that experiences of identity are being are being utilized and understood in the therapy room and in clinical interventions. And so this really points to how important it is to talk about these experiences of identity as predictors of mental health outcomes. And relatedly, really thinking about interventions that are focused on community building, on belonging, because as we can see, belonging does really protect people from experiences of like mental health, poor mental health. And we know this more generally, that belonging is related to better mental and physical health outcomes, but how can we really be thinking about culturally relevant interventions, right? Telling your patients to, like, when was the last time they went to the mosque? When was the last time they went to a gathering with people who looked like them, who shared their culture? In terms of policy, really advocating for a Middle Eastern North African category so that we can really understand what is happening in our community. We know that there is a minoritized experience of this community. And so really thinking about how can we collect the data, because we need the data for us to be able to say, this is what's happening. These are the areas of support that we can provide for the community. These are the areas of strengths that we can just push forward and really build our communities in these ways. And then also support for identity-based spaces. So, if you're working in a corporate world, this research really shows the importance of having like a Muslim space and how that could really impact people's mental health, for example. So that is the end of my presentation. I appreciate everybody's patience with me. I hope you were all able to learn from it, and I welcome questions from my committee.
Thank you.
All right. Well, can I get us started here?
Yep.
All right. Great job in it. I really enjoyed your presentation and enjoyed reading your dissertation.
Thank you.
So I have a theoretical question, and let me sort of couch it, within the context of the class that you took from me.
Okay.
You took issues in multicultural research with me.
I did.
I saw evidence in your document that you paid attention in the class, and so that's good.
Yeah.
And as you know, one of the things that I sort of am known for is issues pertaining to racial and ethnic identity, as well as the measurement of those constructs. And as I was sort of reading your document and just sort of thinking about it, I kept getting stuck on something, and I was trying to figure out, like, what is it that I'm getting stuck on? And I think I just sort of figured it out, and I want you to kind of help me think it through.
Okay.
All right. So in your literature review, you do a good job of sort of talking about Finney, in the article that that you read in my class talks about Finney in the way that Finney talks about ethnic identity in the three components. Ethnicity, as culture, minority status, so you do a really good job with that. And so I'm reading it and I'm thinking, okay, so she spends time doing this. So of course, then she's going to use an ethnic identity measure because it would make sense, because it goes with what she has laid out here theoretically. But then I go and I see that you use Rob Seller's MIBI racial centrality measure.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is nothing in the literature that sort of prepares the reader for why the switch. And so what you have done essentially is the very thing that I have complained about, which is you've conflated both ethnic identity and racial identity and the measurement of ethnic identity and racial identity. So could you just help explain and walk us through your thinking there?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, that's a good point. So I think, so when I took your class, I was definitely thinking about my dissertation and thinking about what are the ways that I could really improve what I end up doing from the concepts that we learned. And so what I really learned from Finney is that so part of that section that I wrote on Finney and the ways that they describe minority identity is I was trying to make an argument for religious identity as a minority identity in the way that Finney describes ethnic identity as an important predictor of mental health outcomes. And so really that's what I was trying to do using Finney's theories and concepts. Was I wasn't thinking about it in terms of this is the way that I'm thinking about identity in order to measure it for my study. And more so it was, Finney is using these ways to talk about ethnic racial identity as a minority, as an identity that affects mental health outcomes in these different ways. And you can place that kind of neatly or in a parallel way to the Muslim religious identity and the Muslim experience, the experience of being American Muslim. And so that I can see how it would make sense, like logically be like, oh yeah, this is an explanation, then using that. But for me, it was more, that's really what I was using Finney for. And then in terms of using Robert Sellers measures, I was more curious about, how important this identity is, the sense of self and identity centrality, and using kind of social identity theory and self-categorization theory to understand that. So I can see the confusion, or kind of like why it may seem a little messy, but that was my thought process.
Okay. So yeah, you're going to need to clarify that and to be really explicit, because logically it doesn't follow that you would start with one theoretical sort of premise, and then you use a measurement that is not in line with that theoretical premise. Right. So yeah, so I need you to sort of really clarify that. Yeah. Which then sort of, because it also made me, it also sort of begged the question in terms of the word Arab. Would you consider the word Arab to be an ethnic term or a racial term?
What a great question, Dr. Cooley. So, so that's a good question, because I think that's a question that I was trying to kind of understand in your class and in Gigi's class, is what is really kind of the difference between ethnicity and race. And so we know that race is really a construct that was created to categorize people in these different ways, whereas ethnicity is more around the ancestry and culture and tradition that you hold. And so in regards to the Arab MENA identity, I think use those terms a little interchangeably in my document, and maybe even in my presentation. And I think that's because according to the census, these are racial categories, but in regards to like the actual traditions and culture, there is like kind of a more general ethnic identity that can be understood. So I feel like both of those things can be like, I think like practically used, but theoretically they are separate from each other.
Hanan, can you maybe explain how the term ethnic racial identity may pertain to your particular study? Like the shift from, Dr. Coakley certainly comes from one school of thought about identity and racial identity and ethnic identity being sort of these completely separate constructs, but can you describe a little bit about why folks have made the argument for the combination of ethnic and racial identity, especially as it pertains to the use of the Sellers subscales?
Yeah, I can try to. So so to my understanding that it's really about how people kind of understand themselves as well. And so when we talk about like race versus ethnicity, it can, like, again, theoretically, we can talk about these things as like separate and like this comes from this place and this comes from this place. But when we're also talking to people and their understanding of themselves, it kind of gets really blurry, and it kind of gets fuzzy and blurry. And so it can be kind of, I'm hesitant to use the word I want to say more like seamless to kind of use these words like together in when I'm talking to people about like, what is your experience, rather than writing a paper about it and in like an academic setting. And so I feel like this is kind of where the like practicality and like the theoretical kind of are like head to head a little bit.
I mean, and I mean, one of the things to note, and maybe this is what you can put in your introduction to also alleviate Dr. Coakley's concerns in this regard, is that both Finney and Sellers actually came from Erickson's you know, they use Erickson specifically as inspiration for their models. So you can go back to the core. So they're actually not that different, except that Rob Sellers wanted to make sure that we're talking about the racialized experience of Black students and Black youth. So when he came up with his scale, so it was a very specific type of thing. But I do think kind of talking about why ethnic racial identity becomes combined, especially for youth. And that's what developmental psychologists who do a lot of race and ethnicity research have argued, that the experience of those constructs are very similar and they don't distinguish outside of Black folks. Black folks do distinguish between an ethnic and a racial identity, but other ethnically minoritized groups don't tend to distinguish in the same way. And so that's maybe something you can discuss a little bit, or just maybe bring up in your intro and your discussion.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds.
I don't know,
I think it
Dr.
would really
Copley, what do
benefit the
you?
paper.
Well said, Dr. Awad. And my final, I guess, comment or observation is you need to go back through and carefully proofread your document. There were a number of mistakes that I document, and I try to correct as many as I could, but at some point I just kind of got lost. I said I can't sort of go through and correct everything. So you need to go through and really carefully document. And I'm sure it's already been pointed out to you that you have the research questions and hypotheses listed both at the end of chapter 2 and then at the beginning of chapter 3. You don't need to have them in both places. You just need to have them in one place. So just choose and go.
Will do. Yeah. I appreciate that. There's definitely a sense of just kind of getting it to you so that we can get to this point, but I'll definitely go through it and fix those errors. Thanks.
All right. I'm finished.
I can jump in real quick. First, really good job. I enjoyed reading your dissertation and learning a lot more about this area of research that you're doing. I think it's really interesting, and I think you have a great trajectory in your future to continue this research. So I'm excited for you. One thing, and this is kind of going back again to this discussion with the separation of ethnic and religious discrimination. And again, I don't want to add like more things for you to do necessarily for the dissertation, but something that may be of interest, maybe when you're working on getting this out for publication, is to maybe compare models with these two as separate variables versus then constraining the correlation between them to be one. And again, I guess a question I have also is, did you actually run the model with them correlated as separate variables?
Yeah, I did. And it was giving me a lot of errors. It wasn't, it wouldn't run. And it was actually then that I was like, let me double check this real quick.
Gotcha.
More easily identified that multicollinearity.
Okay.
So I did.
Gotcha. Yeah. And that makes sense then. So I don't know. Yeah. So you wouldn't be able to compare that. So,
right.
But I'm also wondering too, I mean, you could run a model and constrain the correlation between those to be one. But then I'm not sure if you would see any differences in terms of their direct effects to like sense of belonging or distress. I'm not sure, but that could be something maybe to look at later. And you could actually test those effects to see if they're different. But I get what you're saying, that it is a really overlapping construct.
I'd probably have to set up a meeting with you to walk through that a little bit, but I appreciate that.
Yeah, and it may not, I mean, I'm just trying to think if it would add anything more interesting than what you've already found, and I'm not sure that it would, but we can definitely talk about it
and see.
And then just kind of going back to when you're talking about a just identified model, and that you dropped the correlation because it was small, which I think is fine. I do want to, I guess, caution that maybe a reviewer might be like, well, you're kind of cherry picking what you want to put in the model just to get model fit. And again, there's so much talk about model fit. Like it's like a love-hate kind of relationship with model fit. Like we love it because you can get that information, but we hate it too, because it's like people rely so heavily on it and use these cutoffs. So anyways, just something to think about, that, you know, I think you could still have interesting things to talk about, even with a just identified model, right? Even if you went in and because the main things you're talking about are really kind of the information within the model, like what you're finding, not necessarily the global model itself.
Exactly. Yeah, I think dropping that covariate was really just to kind of get the model fit information. But the numbers themselves really didn't change, which I talked about in my, like, really nothing, no relationships changed with it or without it. Would that be a barrier to like with reviewers to?
I don't think so. I mean, I feel so if you look at all like regressions, right? All multiple regression models are just identified models, and they talk about R square, they talk about the beta coefficient, you know, I mean, they talk about effect sizes. You know, so I think, you know, this is a similar place for you to kind of talk about that. So I know some people would love to be, anyway, like I said, it's like this love-hate thing I have with model fit, because it's great. But then it's like, really, do we have to rely solely on
decisions?
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't personally, I don't think it would be like, if I were your reviewer, it wouldn't be a barrier for me. That doesn't mean you might have a reviewer that is like really gung-ho on model fit, which there are a lot of people like that. But, you know, at the end of the day, if you can live with what the reviewers are asking you to do to your model, then, you know, do what the reviewers are. Do what they ask you, as long as you can look yourself in the mirror.
Okay.
Basically with that.
All right, I appreciate
and
that.
then I had one last question, just for kind of clarification. Like, I know you use bootstrapping to test for those indirect effects, and I was just wondering, did you do regular bootstrapping, or was it the bias corrected method? Do you remember?
I would have to look that up.
No worries. And again, and there's mixed sort of feelings about regular bootstrapping for indirect effects or bias corrected bootstrapping, which I tend to do bias corrected just because people love it so much more. But just like clarify what type you did.
Okay. In the paper, will do.
Yeah.
I just want to make a quick note about how there's so many differences of opinion around all of these different pieces, like ethnic racial identity, bias versus bootstrapping, model fit. And it just is like so parallel to the differences of opinion that happens in every field. Yeah.
For sure. Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But I would say probably a larger consensus, or kind of recommending bias corrected stuff. But I think either is fine. So
I'll definitely make a clarification for sure in my document, but thank you.
Sounds good. But really good work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hanan, I just also want to say it's been an honor to be on this journey with you. Almost a decade. If not a decade.
It's been more than a decade for sure. Yeah.
So I'm very excited that we're at this point. I'm just very excited and honored, and you did a great job. I do have a couple suggestions. More of it is in terms of clarity and making the dissertation more cleaner. So some of that which Dr. Copley mentioned. In addition to kind of the reading, also really thinking about clarifying, for example, when you're talking about sense of belonging, really being clear in the introduction that it's not specific, it's not very clear if you're referring to sense of belonging to a community or general. And so I think stating that this is right now, and that this stage of the research, you're only referring to general as opposed to specific community. And the other thing, what I would suggest is in the dissertation, when you did kind of make an update to the model, I don't see the updated version in here that you presented. So you mention it in the writing, but not an actual visual representation. So I didn't.
Oh, like the actual path model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
because I remember I was okay, what's the difference? I don't, not like, I see that you've written the difference, but I don't see the changes that you made. And I would also suggest you include some of the visual representations that you made of the relationship when you're looking about sense of belonging. I think that would be really helpful to kind of clarify what you're saying.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I definitely want it to be readable. So, and yeah, for people to understand what I'm saying. So.
All right.
All right. Can I stop sharing?
So
yeah, I can stop sharing.
yeah. So one of the things I want you to do, Hannah.
Okay.
Great job. I've
Thank you.
seen the document many a time.
Yeah, thank you.
Is I think I want you to think a little bit about the disentangling racial and ethnic identity and why it's combined in terms of how you actually are completing the, like your participants complete the questionnaire and what they're asked about in terms of discrimination versus how they're asked about identity. And when you're asked about identity, you're literally talking about yourself and how you feel about yourself versus discrimination is something that is happening to you that you're reporting on, and how those two mechanisms are actually different, that it'll help you distinguish those constructs from one another. Like getting back to Dr. Copley's first question about why did you choose to do this with discrimination and not identity? I think that's another way to think about it. Just the how discrimination occurs. All of your explanations were great, but just to also add another layer of like the way that it's measured, you're dependent on like your experience of something external that is happening to you versus like internal kind of things when you're talking about identity.
Yeah.
And I have it in notes, don't worry about it. That's something.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But good job. And yeah, great job. I'm happy. I'm happy to also see this day come. So what I'm gonna do now, does anybody have any additional questions or comments? Okay, so we, the committee, will go deliberate in our little committee breakout room and we will be back. So hang tight.
Okay, I will be right here.
Actually, I can't get to the breakout rooms anymore. What is going on? Oh, there it is. Okay. So,
You got it? Okay.
yeah, I see it.
Dr. Samira, did you get it?
Sure. Yep.
All right. Whew, they're gone.
Congratulations on finishing the presentation and interrogation. You did really, really, really well.
Oh, thanks. Every time they started asking a question, I was like, am I going to understand the words that are coming out of their mouth?
I felt that, but you did it. You did it. Take a deep breath.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Okay. I hope they come back with good news. Yeah.
I'm confident they will.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
There's so many pieces of this paper that I wanted to
know.
be able to capture.
How are you feeling?
I don't know. I feel like I don't know. I feel like I need them to come back and be like, okay, we're good. I don't know. It feels like a weird, like, did this really happen type of feeling. Oh, thanks, Jendai.
I think you did a great job, Hannah.
Oh, thank you,
I
Marie.
learned a lot. You did a great job. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks. yeah, I was very, very nervous yesterday. Well, for a long time, I was just like, oh, it's just another meeting. I'm just going to talk about my research. And then yesterday I started getting really nervous. I still feel like I'm still going to present it. It doesn't feel completely done yet. But it is done, right? We're done. You heard that. Y'all were all there. Yeah.
Yeah, it happened. It happened. It's recorded. It's done. And it made so much sense. You did such a beautiful job, like explaining everything in like simple terms, you know, to the extent that we can.
Yeah. I tried really hard. There are some things I was like, I can't describe this in other words. So I did the best. Yeah.
It did, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm so glad that y'all were here to witness.
Yeah, at one point you had like 40 people on the call. Just wanted to shout out that you have a lot of
okay.
supporters.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah. Oh, wow. Thanks everybody for being here. It's very kind. I appreciate the support. I feel like we've all been in this together. It's a group effort getting a PhD.
You're getting a lot of comments too in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Hayofat. You can unmute yourself if you wanted to. Hala ula. I love how I feel like the community is here. Speaking of like belonging and community and identity. So
we love you, Hanan.
oh, thanks, Hannah.
Very, very proud of you, mashallah. My tears are down right now. Can't wait for them to announcing the Dr. Hanan, inshallah.
Oh, I hope it's very dramatic.
You did great, mashallah, mashallah.
Thanks,
Great work.
thank you.
We'll see. We'll celebrate when you come to Michigan, inshallah.
Inshallah, yeah. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Yeah.
It was very interesting. Well, I didn't feel the time. Seriously.
Nice. Okay, good.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Yeah, this is something
that's true, dude. I didn't feel it either.
Yeah. Oh, who is that? I can't.
Who is that?
Oh, Sohaib. Hey, Sohaib.
What's up, dude? Yeah, straight up, I didn't feel the time. I looked at the time when you started talking about implications, and it was like 45 minutes in.
Nice. Yeah. I really want to make research like easy to it's all easy to understand. I think that there's sometimes people make it really complicated.
I mean, the point of it, right? It communicates than what's doing research.
Yeah, the point is, I mean, I'm doing this.
A great job.
So that
really
people
good.
can understand. Yeah, so I'm glad that the messages came through. Yeah. After this, so I think I'm gonna have to, like the edits that they told me, I'm gonna have to make those edits and then submit it and work on the next paper, right? Right behind.
Correct. Papers. That's how we roll.
Welcome back.
Okay, well, I just want to say congratulations, Dr. Hanan Hashim.
Nice.
Woo!
Thank you. Oh my God, wow.
Congrats. We added another doctor to the Hashim family.
حبيبتي حنان ما شاء الله.
Oh, thanks, Ma. That's my mom.
All right, I'm gonna take a picture of you all.
Oh, thank you so much. Wow.
Thank you, Gigi.
Oh,
Hey,
my pleasure.
We should ask everyone to turn on their camera so that we can get a picture of this. This is really beautiful.
Is there a way to like get everybody on the screen?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. I can do 2 screens. Well, here, I have everybody with a picture.
Okay.
How exciting.
Yay. Thanks for being here, everybody. Wow.
This is the biggest one I've ever chaired, I will say.
Oh, wow. Okay. Testament to all the cool people in my life. Wow. Oh, look, this is my dad. Oh my God, I'm tearing up.
Congratulations, Mama and Baba.